Good morning. Welcome to this presentation about the Vietnamese language, which I think we have heard very little of so far. My name is Gaston or Gaston or Gaston or Gaston, whatever you prefer. I listen to all of those forms. I'm a writer of book. Here I am. Let me show myself. Yeah, there he is. I'm a writer of books about languages and linguistics, such as these. And I will actually soon be accompanied by a native speaker of Vietnamese called Huyền. Here she is, and who has her own language center in Vietnam. And she will introduce herself in a few minutes. So, I know that at this very moment, Simon Ager is giving a talk about the global diversity of writing systems, which is, of course, a fascinating subject. We just saw that when Judith Meyer spoke about the similar subject. And I myself would have loved to attend that talk, but in the end I decided against it. And I'm very pleased that all of you have preferred to learn a little bit about Vietnamese and why it might be a good idea to learn it, or perhaps not, after all. We can be fairly confident that Simon Ager, is not talking about Vietnamese at this moment, because this particular language is written in a familiar script, familiar to nearly all of us, I think. Not necessarily, yeah, probably all of us, namely the Latin alphabet, the Roman alphabet. And that gives us the first reason, or at least one reason, not necessarily the most important one, to choose Vietnamese, because if you're interested in learning an Asian language, you have very few to choose from if, and that's a big if, of course, I know, and especially after Judith's talk, I know that even more keenly. If you want to stay within your own comfort zone of the Roman alphabet. Because in Asia, there are actually very few, on the Asian mainland, there are actually very few languages spoken that use the Roman alphabet. Here they are, that's Turkey in the West and some other Turkic languages. There's Malaysian or Malay in Malaysia and also in Indonesia actually. And there is Vietnamese. Of course, other writing systems are fascinating, but they are, in spite of Judith's books, a considerable additional burden to language learning for most of us. However, in calling the Vietnamese script familiar, I may be overstating the thing a bit, because the script definitely has a character all its own. And that's because of its heavy use of diacritics. I usually say or accent signs, but I don't have to translate the word diacritics to this audience. Some of those diacritics actually use change the quality of the vowel or consonant, such as these, whereas others change the tone, the melody of the vowel, such as these, and as if that weren't enough, the two may be combined, giving us things like letters like these. And to my mind, these letters in the lower row are a lot like wedding cakes. They remind me of wedding cakes. On average, each Vietnamese word has one, give or take, one diacritic, and that includes, of course, personal names. For instance, the personal name of my co-presenter and teacher, this is her name. I'm not going to try and pronounce it, even at this stage, and because she can do it much better. So let me give her, well, unfortunately not the floor, but certainly the screen.
Hi everyone, my name is Phạm Bảo Thanh Huyền, where Huyền is my given name and Phạm Bảo is my family name. I am an English teacher in my own center in one of the biggest cities in Vietnam. I can speak English, I can speak Spanish, Catalan, German. I also have conversational skills in Mandarin, and I'm learning Turkish as well. So as a polyglot, I would have loved to be in person with you today.
But she couldn't make it. Could you understand this audio fairly well? Can I see? Yeah, people are nodding. Good, thank you. Well, before looking into the pros and cons of learning Vietnamese, let me give you a tiny bit of general information. The language belongs to the Austro-Asiatic family of languages. Here it is. You can probably tell where Vietnamese is. Here, the pink one. It's by far the largest language in the family, with nearly 100 million speakers. And the second largest has only 20 million or so. That's Khmer in Cambodia. And all the others are much, much smaller in terms of numbers of speakers. Let me also mention, that could easily be misunderstood, let me also mention that Vietnamese is not a relative of Chinese, of neither Mandarin nor any of the other Chinese languages, but the historical links between the two are very close, because for 1,000 years, roughly from 100 BCE until 900 CE, Vietnam, the north of Vietnam, was part of the Chinese Empire, so that leaves some mark. And up until the 19th century, that's fairly recent, isn't it? The Vietnamese language was mostly written in a script based on Chinese characters. Yeah, there it is. It's called Chữ Nom. It wasn't used a lot because the language wasn't written a lot. Chinese was written more, even in Vietnam. Compared to the modern wedding cake script, it's definitely much more intimidating. This one is more intimidating, I should say. One more thing about the two languages is that they both belong to what's known as the East Asian linguistic area. Now, that's a linguistic concept meaning that these languages have become more similar over time, just like European languages have in many ways. That's in terms of grammar, in terms of pronunciation, and that's mostly the result of Chinese cultural dominance or preeminence, or whatever you like to call it. And one very clear example of that is that over 2,000 years, Vietnamese has adopted loads and even more loads of Chinese vocabulary. I'm saying Chinese because it's usually not Mandarin. I'll get back to that later. And talking about borrowing, from the 19th century on, some French words trickled into the language. French was the colonial power at the time. And since the 1970s or 80s, like everywhere else in the world, English words have entered the language, but not to a very large extent. Now, we promised 10 reasons to study Vietnamese and 5 to regret it. And we've decided to put the reasons to regret it first. That's sort of a persuasive trick, because by the time we have heard all the reasons to do it, you may have forgotten why not to do it. So, number 1, the first reason why you might not learn Vietnamese or start and then regret it is it's just bloody difficult. This is not a Ljubljana dragon, by the way. This is a Vietnamese dragon, and it's way fiercer. If you're an adult speaker of some European language or some Indian language or Persian or some African language, or basically any language that's not East Asian, you're going to find Vietnamese difficult. I can guarantee that. I tried and I failed. I met Huyen through Italki, one of the sponsors of the event, I think, and this is what she says.
So far, I can say that I have more than 100 students on Italki, and 80% of them quit within a month. And I think that another 10% quit within the next 3 months. The remaining 10% just continue doing it for family reasons, like they have parents who are Vietnamese or they want to marry a Vietnamese girl or so. So I can tell that, yeah, it is relatively difficult for Europeans to learn.
I do not have Vietnamese ancestry and I do not have a Vietnamese girlfriend, so I think I'm not doing so badly after all. I stayed with it for a year or so, or a year and a half, and I'm still working on it a bit. One major difficulty is that Vietnamese pronunciation is very, very difficult. And that's mostly because, like Mandarin, it has these tones, these famous tones. And Mandarin has 4, Vietnamese goes 1 better, 2 better, it has 6. And it's not even awfully hard to pronounce those tones. You can wrap your tongue around them. I can distinguish qua from qua, and qua and qua, and I even know what they mean. But when people are talking to you in whole sentences, and you have to pay attention to every single syllable and listen which of the 6 tones you're hearing, that's when it gets tough, for me anyway. And if Huyen had been able to come in person, she would now have done some practical exercises with you, which I'm sure would have been fun. But at least she can demonstrate what it's like, using the word zur.
Alright, so let's take one example with the word zur. If I say this word with different tones, it means a different fruit. So the first word, zur, without tone, means a watermelon. But if I say it with a rising tone, which is zur, that means a pineapple. And if I say it with a lowering tone, like zur, it will make it a coconut. So imagine that I have to go to the supermarket and order zur. What fruit do you think I'm asking for?
I think that's the coconut, but I'm not sure. Unfortunately, it's not just the tones that are tough for us. Learning vocabulary also is. I mean, like zur, it's okay to learn it's coconut and melon and pineapple, but you'll agree it's not even remotely like any of those words. And while that is normal in many languages, Vietnamese has particularly few words where you do find similarities with European languages. Chinese is a different story. I'll get back to that. Grammar. This was vocabulary and tone. Grammar, at first, seems easy. It has no declensions, no conjugations, no plurals, no gender. None of that stuff that makes European languages really tricky, if you think about it. But it's hard. Vietnamese is hard in places where at least, where one, perhaps, wouldn't expect it. And, well, one famous example are the classifiers that Chinese learners among you will recognize. I'll explain. In Vietnamese, you can't say one orange or this orange. You have to say something like one fruit orange or this fruit orange. You can't say one cow. You have to say something like one beast cow. And that makes sort of sense, but then you also say one beast river and one beast knife, and that's when it starts to get strange. Most words are actually not all that illogical, but it occurs quite a bit. And then there are the difficulties that are not clearly grammatical, though they might be. I was discussing that with Camille yesterday, who speaks some Vietnamese, more than I do, definitely. And he said maybe it is grammar, and he may be right. I would like to call it the pragmatics of the language. An example is, in European languages you can say, I don't understand what you're saying. Ich verstehe nicht, was du sagst. Je ne comprends pas ce que tu dis. No entiendo lo que dices. Things like that. Not so in Vietnamese. What you say is toi nghe không hiểu, which literally is I listen without understanding. I listen, not understand. Something like that. Makes perfect sense. Nothing illogical about it. It's just not what we are used to. It's not what springs to mind. And this is just one example. This is how the language works. It makes perfect sense, but it also makes life perfectly miserable. So, perhaps for an audience like this, I shouldn't say that Vietnamese is hard to conquer. Maybe I should frame it differently. Maybe I should say that it's a lovely challenge for the advanced learner. That may be a better way of putting it. And now let us for a second also look at the flip side of this coin. If Vietnamese is hard for most of us, unless you're East Asian, that strongly suggests that languages like English and German and Spanish and Catalan, all of which Huyền speaks, are hard for her and hard for Vietnamese. So Huyền, tell us, what is it about English that, for instance, your Vietnamese students find difficult?
There are a variety of things in English that we find it challenging, but I think the two biggest problems that we usually face, first is phrasal verbs. What I mean with this is that with one verb in English, if you combine it with other preposition, the meanings just totally change. For example, look forward or look up to or look down on someone. In Vietnamese, we have different words for that. So it is very confusing for most Vietnamese students when learning English. And another thing that I want to mention is about the pronunciation. As with Vietnamese, we don't need to pronounce the ending sound of every word. So, for example, in English, if it is Facebook, Vietnamese people will pronounce it like Facebook. Or if it is internet, we will say it like internet. And there is no ending sound to it. In some cases, we also turn the diphthong into monophthong. So, for example, the word here in English would be here in Vietnamese. We make it really short, and it sounds like a monophthong.
Yeah, and I think the bit about the phrasal verbs is something that, for instance, Romance speakers can easily relate to, and perhaps Slavic speakers too, I'm not sure. So anyway, that was reason number one, lovely challenge. Then, number two, learning resources are scarce and of uneven quality. If you want to learn, well, French, Spanish, Russian, Mandarin, even smaller languages like Hungarian, Norwegian, Dutch, you are spoiled with choice. There are lots of books, grammars, dictionaries, and more modern things that I cannot think of offhand. I like to think of these resources as bridges that take you from the ignorant shore of the language river to the opposite shore where you're fluent. That's what these bridges, these resources do. In the case of Japanese, it's more like this. There's very little choice and, well, it's less comfortable. And to be frank, it's more like this, really. Because many of the resources are not all that good. There are several courses, of course, and some of them are good. Don't get me wrong. There are some fine courses out there. But finding a decent dictionary is not easy in the sense that there are quite a few that are rubbish, that are really bad. And there is just no grammar book. I mean, not because Vietnamese has no grammar. I'm not saying that. There's one grammar book from 1965, which is really only for native speakers and linguists. And there are some very, very poor, cheap booklets that you can buy, but they're not much use, really. As for teachers, well, there are teachers, of course, but they have a hard time of it too. And listen to Huyền again.
When I want to teach Vietnamese, the thing that I find really hard is that we have to find the materials ourselves on the internet, and we have to adapt the materials for the students' need. There is no community of Vietnamese teacher where we can find help from other people or help each other. There is no community like that. And talking about textbook or materials, as I told you earlier, there is no acceptable textbook that I can find in any bookstore. So that is bad news.
If you heard strange rumbling in the background, there was motorcycles. They were everywhere in Vietnam. There's no getting around them. Well, the reason for this situation obviously is that there is relatively little demand for the language, which is a problem I'm trying to solve here. Number three is that Vietnamese is of limited use. There's no getting around that either. It's spoken in just one country. Here's a world map, as you will see. The green worm-shaped area is where Vietnamese is spoken. And there's this circle, but don't over-interpret it. It's not where you can find your way with Vietnamese. People will not understand you anywhere. It's just to find Vietnam on the map. Of course, there are Vietnamese speakers elsewhere too, especially in Europe, North America, and quite a few in Australia. So should you be interested in learning Vietnamese, it's probably possible to find native speakers near you. But still, in terms of usefulness, Vietnamese clearly doesn't compare with, say, Persian, which is spoken in 3 countries and more people. It's Swahili, spoken in 6 or 7 or 8 countries, and Portuguese, spoken even more, and that's without mentioning Spanish or French or English. Okay, so that's limited usefulness. The next problem is this.
Vietnamese has many dialects, and as even for me, who is the native speaker, I find it difficult sometimes to understand some of them. I traveled to Hue in the central region several years ago, and I tried to speak to the hotel receptionist. And I have to say that after 5 times asking her to repeat what she said, I couldn't understand. So, as you can tell, it can be quite challenging for me or any second language speaker. And on top of that, the standard language is not yet settled, which means there are still a lot of debates about how to correctly pronounce each word.
So, many dialects and no standard language. That's my idea of a linguistic nightmare for the foreign language learner. And I know that you're now expecting downside number 5, and you are going to get it, but a bit later on. There's a reason for that. So, these have been the things to discourage you, and now I would like you to forget them. And we will list 10 reasons, at very least, to go ahead and study Vietnamese regardless. Actually, we've already mentioned one reason. Sorry, Judith Meyer, I'm still going to mention it. The script. There it is. Yeah, the script. For number 2, let's listen to Huyền again.
The second reason why you might consider learning Vietnamese is for economic opportunities. As a matter of fact, the Vietnam economy has been growing really fast recently, with the GDP growth rate almost 7%, which is quite impressive, and it has been that way for decades. Also, the tourism industry, the manufacturing industry, commerce, etc. is also booming. So it makes complete economic sense to learn Vietnamese.
Exactly. Economic opportunity. Then there's another type of opportunity, which is strictly linguistic in nature. As we've seen, Vietnamese is very different from all European languages and most other languages, but that also means that the thing that makes it so difficult to learn is what helps you to develop a feel for how varied human language can actually be. There are, of course, other languages who can install that idea in you or can give you a feel for that. But Vietnamese is a good choice. Generally speaking, East Asia is the place to do that, because these languages are also very different from what we Europeans, North Americans, Australians, also Africans, Indians, etc. are used to. Then, reason number 4. I don't want this to look like a Visit Vietnam campaign, but Vietnam is an attractive place. I wouldn't want you to travel there. I mean, it's very unsustainable to travel that far, but still, if you are thinking of traveling far anyway, you might consider Vietnam. I went there and I actually enjoyed it a lot. Though, if you have asthma, don't go to the cities, because they're pretty horrible in that respect. So be kind on your lungs and throat. This reason, number 4, will be all the more persuasive, I guess, if I add, truthfully, that the Vietnamese as a people, I don't like that. I don't like it when people say, oh, the Chinese or the Japanese or the Brazilians are so lovely. I mean, that's rubbish, of course, because you have nice and not so nice people everywhere. But my experience in Vietnam has been very pleasant in several ways. Namely, people responded in very helpful and friendly and kind manners throughout. I was not stared at, even though I'm much taller than the average Vietnamese and look different. I was allowed to go around minding my own business until I needed help and would ask, and people would help me. I mean, it's not everywhere you find that. I'm not going to mention other countries, but it's not everywhere you find that. It's also true for Slovenia, for Ljubljana. So that is absolutely one more positive factor in favor of Vietnam and learning the language. By the way, my least favorite group in Vietnam are the motorcycle taxi drivers, but even they would, cheat you in the friendliest way imaginable. That's really... Now, what about number 6? What might be that? Right, yes.
And the reason is that it makes it much easier to learn Chinese. So, in fact, a lot of Vietnamese people here around me is learning Chinese now, and they always say that it takes them only 3 months or even much less than that to learn Chinese. And I did really suspect that. So before I went to China earlier this year, I decided to give it a go, and I took up some Chinese, and it took me only probably 2 months to got that conversational level in Chinese, just enough to, to be confident to talk to Chinese people once I'm there. And I did talk to people when I was there, and I was really satisfied with what I can achieve.
Now, while this is undoubtedly true, I have to make some observations, to add some observations. I wouldn't want you to come away from this talk that learning Vietnamese is the best way to start learning Mandarin. I'm sure that native speakers of Vietnamese have this huge advantage, but if it's Mandarin you want, it's Mandarin you have to study. It's the most efficient way, I'm sure. Moreover, while Vietnamese has indeed borrowed loads and loads of Chinese words, they tend not to be from Mandarin, but from the several southern Chinese languages. And they are related, obviously, the northern and the southern Chinese languages, very closely related and written more or less in the same script. But there are substantial differences, and just for those few of you who haven't studied Mandarin, let me give you an example. The Vietnamese word for university consists of 3 elements, Chuan Dai Ho, literally a place or a school for great learning. And here they are listed in a table. Now let's add the Mandarin words on the left. I've left out the tone signs, by the way. I know there are no tone signs on these words. As you can see, the first 2 of them are somewhat related, but the southern Chinese words in several southern Chinese languages are much more closely related. So if you want to learn Cantonese or Hakka, yes, by all means, Vietnamese is highly useful, but for Mandarin, perhaps a bit less so. My impression, and I haven't calculated this, but my impression is that Mandarin is about as similar to Vietnamese, you still with me, as French is to Spanish, but French written in cuneiform. That's about the relation, I think. So, in conclusion then, about this point number 6, Huyen is of course right, but if you take up Vietnamese for the sake of Mandarin, you're going to be disappointed and frustrated. And I owed you one more reason to why you would regret taking up Vietnamese, and this is it. Don't do it for the sake of Mandarin, because it's not all that similar. Okay, on to reason number 7, why you should, you should consider learning Vietnamese. that's its rarity. It's a lesser studied language. It has a certain snob appeal. And you may frown on this, though I'm not sure if this crowd will frown on that, but it's true. At some parties, I'm pretty sure people will come up to you because they've heard you studying Vietnamese and they will want to know all about it. At other parties, less so. I mean, you may be eschewed on other parties. So it depends a bit on your social circle whether that is a real, genuine reason. But maybe here at this conference I should pitch it differently, because some of you, not most of you, but some of you have learned so many languages already, you know, with all these stickers here on your badge, that you may consider Vietnamese a language off the beaten path, off the road, well traveled. I mean, that's another way of looking at it. And then,
hey, wait a minute, I have to disagree with you here, because the Vietnamese population is already 90 million people, and in only a few years' time, there will be more than 100 million native speakers. So it is hardly a small language anymore, I would say. So its size alone makes it one of the good reasons to learn the language.
Okay, good point. That's reason number 8, isn't it? Yeah. And no, 7. That was 7. And, okay, the number of speakers is a reason in its own right. And then on with number 9.
And here's number 9. It is a great place to broaden your cultural horizon. And I had the same experience when I visited Europe, South Asia, or Tibet. And I'm sure that visiting Vietnam can do the same for Western people.
I agree. Actually, I'm quite passionate about this one. I'm sure I would have got more out of my trip to Vietnam if I had attained any meaningful degree of speaking the language. And I did experience just that when, years ago, I made several trips to Latin America. I did speak Spanish. And I felt that there were these much more rewarding conversations. Well, probably most of you have had this experience. All these rewarding conversations, and you would find interesting cultural differences, and you would have similarities that you didn't see coming at all. You would have this experience of shared humanity with people you'd never dreamt you would meet, things like that. And of course, you can have conversations like that in English in many countries. But for one thing, it's not exactly the same, and for another, in many countries, including Vietnam, it's just a small minority that speaks English. I mean, in Vietnam, Ho Yen does, and I've met some other people, but it's pretty rare. Okay, so that's number 9, which I find very important. And then there's reason number 10. And I've already hinted at it, and I've heard other people also hint at it. It makes other languages seem easy. And I actually mean this quite seriously. I'm not being flippant here at all. Knowing a little, okay, I know that Russian or Icelandic or Finnish, they're not exactly pieces of cake, I wouldn't say that at all. But they're not as hard as all that, really. There are many similarities, and this 10th reason may sound paradoxical, but yeah, think about it. If you haven't thought about it before, there's really something to it. That's number 10. I promised 10 reasons. But where does that leave me? What were my reasons? I actually had a different reason still. And I scribbled something here on my notes. Yeah, exactly. I should add that I really sincerely hope that many of you will take up the challenge. I mean, I'm not doing this job just to be on a stage. I mean, that's not what I'm interested in. Number 11. I write about languages, right? And I wanted to write about Vietnamese, and in a book I was working on, and this is the book, and Vietnamese was going to be the opening chapter. I had already decided that before learning. It was going to be the opening chapter. And I felt that reporting on my own adventures and mostly misadventures in Vietnamese would make for a perhaps interesting chapter. And, well, that's for the reader to decide if that has worked out. But however, now that the book is finished, now the book is out there, well, actually it will be out next week, what am I to do? Am I to continue? And I'm sure most of you would say, yeah, by all means, do, go ahead. But it's not easy, as you know. And much as I like Huyền, she's not sufficient motivation to pursue Vietnamese. I mean, she speaks English and Spanish and German, so why should we can talk in any of those languages. So, in spite of that, I haven't given up. I'm still working on the vocabulary and working on it every day, as most of you probably are on some language. And I've even made some progress. So, not in speaking, frankly. I'm still absolutely 0 in speaking and a -1 in understanding, but at least in reading. And let me show you the evidence. Here are some books that I am working on. This is actually the one that I can do, sort of. It's for 4 to 6 year old or 5 to 7 year old children. Yeah, 3 to 7. My next target is this very advanced manga. But I have to be realistic. I mean, it will take, I guess, some magic to really get into Vietnamese. So let me see if I can. Yeah, it may work after all. I'm still hopeful. Thank you. Well, magic works in PowerPoint, that's nice. Okay, finally, if you want to contact, well, me, I'll be around here, and Huyền isn't, so here are her, if you want her to be your teacher, or if you want to visit her in Hải Phòng in Vietnam, this is where you can find her, this is where you can find me, which leaves us really with just one thing. Oh, yeah, I'll wait a bit because people are taking pictures of these coordinates of these data. Yeah, I think I can go on. So
goodbye, everybody. Thank you for your attention and your interest in Vietnamese.
Exactly. And I join the previous speaker in thanking you for coming and for your attentive listening. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. She could answer them much better, of course, but alas, you'll have to make do with me. Thank you very much.
I think I could add a 12th reason for learning the language, maybe, if you agree.
Sure
I took a lesson on italki for half an hour, and we ended up speaking for 2, so that's great. And what my Vietnamese teacher told me was that you need far less vocabulary to be able to speak, and with 30 words I was like, wow, I can speak so much, which I didn't have with a lot of other languages, so you could get through the vocabulary quicker, and you have more of an idea that you can actually communicate with people if you are quick to learn pronunciation.
Mm-hmm. There are 2 reasons why I think you may well be right. One reason is that, very generally speaking, when I learn a foreign language, reading and even writing are things that I find way easier than speaking and listening. I mean, that's just a general weakness in my language learning practice. That's one thing, which doesn't apply to most of you, I'm sure. The other thing is more general, and that is I have noticed that and Huyền has told me, that in Vietnamese the difference between the spoken language and the more formal, much more formal, written language is huge. So that I do suspect that the spoken language, as you say, is, requires less knowledge, much less knowledge of vocabulary than writing, reading, or the, well, if you want to speak very officially, let's say, very formally, that difference is really huge. Some of you may, well, not many, I guess, but some of you may speak Welsh. Are any people here who speak Welsh? Yeah, there's another one. I was told that in Welsh too, the difference between the spoken dialects and the formal literary language, or the language used in newspapers, that there's a wide abyss there, that they're very different. Well, that's, I don't see anybody nodding, that worries me a bit. No? Not that much. Okay, I've got conflicting information now. So anyway, but it's certainly the case for Vietnamese. And actually, when I asked Huyền to translate a letter for me, which she was pleased to do, she said, yeah, but it's not going to be as stylish as it should be. So apparently there's really a difference in register there.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on difficulty because, as you know, that's very subjective and it depends what you experience.
Absolutely.
So my experience is Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Thai, Lao, and then Vietnamese. And so for difficulty, I always say that the most difficult for me as a tonal language is Vietnamese. Getting used to it. Now I have no problem, but just getting used to it first. And of course, as you may know, the tones are different from the south and the north, and they drop one to south, and the way they use them is not exactly the same. I don't find necessarily other aspects of it very difficult. Of course, I have all that vocabulary from Japanese and Korean and Chinese. And I'm saying Chinese in the sense of, okay, Putonghua, but the thing is, the pronunciation in Vietnamese is very close to it as it is in Korean the most, and then Japanese. And I have a lot of Vietnamese students at my university in Japan. We're studying Japanese, and yeah, they immediately recognize a lot of terms in economics and management, etc.
Absolutely, yes.
It sounds very close to the way they know it, and very far from Mandarin, as you're pointing out.
Yeah. Actually, one word that I find relatively easy to remember in Vietnamese is, if I say it correctly, Hiện Đại, which means modern, and that is the same meaning of the Korean word, which I don't know how to pronounce, but it is also the well-known car brand name. Maybe you could pronounce it in Korean for me. The Korean word for modern. Yeah.
Hyundai.
Hyundai. So Hyundai.
Hyundai and
Hyundai.
Hyundai.
Yeah. Well, I haven't learned any Korean at all. So
or in Saigon, they say Hyundai.
Yeah. Okay.
For someone who learned Chinese already or speaks Chinese, you know how a lot of the Vietnamese vocabulary is from Chinese. Mm-hmm. So in your opinion, could someone use that to their advantage? For example, where you have the new Vietnamese word, and then maybe in brackets the Chinese characters that it corresponds to, even though in Vietnam they don't use Chinese characters anymore.
Correct. Actually, if you go to Wiktionary.org, which is sort of my daily work of reference, you will find the characters that were formerly used in Vietnam, and then from those characters you can click them and go to the character web page, to the Wiktionary page, and you will find the Chinese Mandarin pronunciation and meaning, other pronunciations, Japanese, if applicable.
Oh yeah,
there's one more. So
yeah.
Wiktionary helps a great deal there.
Oh, okay, because on the same respect, I would even be interested in learning something they really don't use anymore. They don't use the Chunom characters anymore. You know how
they don't. No,
there were Chinese characters, as you know.
Today's Vietnamese can't read those characters, except specialists, of course.
Oh, they're beautiful, though. They actually invented Chinese characters for the native Vietnamese words.
Yeah, well, this is simplifying it a bit because some of the characters do not exist in Chinese.
No, that's true, they don't.
Okay.
Yeah, like you know how nam is 5, so it's 5, and then it has the Chinese character south, because it sounds like that one.
I'm not sure what you're...
No,
I'm
saying the Chunom character for 5. You know how it's nam in Vietnamese, nam for 5?
Yeah, that's right.
And so it has the Chinese character 5 and the Chinese character for south, because that's also pronounced like nam in Vietnamese.
Yeah. There are those differences, correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think they have that a little mixed up because Chunom is actually straight Chinese characters. They didn't change them at all. The one you're talking about is called Quốc ngữ, and that means national language. There was a division after Chunom. Quốc ngữ came, that's when they wrote Chinese characters in their own grammar. Chunom, they write Vietnamese in the Chinese way. So Chunom was the beginning of when they adopted it. Quốc ngữ was when they adapted it to Vietnamese language. So it's a step in between.
Could we interject here? We were commenting to each other, and we were saying that people from Hanoi always say that they can't understand Hui. It's just in their mindset. It's their attitude, more than anything else.
Well, I'm not at all a specialist in the Chunom script, but to the best of my understanding, the page that I showed was in Chunom, and I don't think that was straight Chinese. I think there were some characters that wouldn't make sense in Chinese, but I could be wrong there. But I think that's what I found when I was looking it up. We could discuss that later on in the break. I would love to hear that. If there are no further questions, then, as I said, and now this is the salesman talking, my book Babel is coming out next week. It will not be available until then, anywhere in the world, except here today in Ljubljana. So I've brought some 10 or 12 copies, which you can buy for 85 cents per language. That makes 17 euros. And you'll find me and my glamorous wife at the back of the room. And so don't be shy. I've also brought some other books. End of sales talk, sales pitch. I thank you once again for coming, for listening, for asking questions, for commenting. And, well, I'll be around. Thank you.